All right, we're going to go over our last topic for the semester, and we'll have some examples this week and next week. And we'll go from there and see how it goes. This is week 13. Next week is week 14, week 15, and then finals week. So we'll see how that goes as far as what we're going to do week 15. At any rate, our topic is AJAX. AJAX stands for, AJAX is one of those things that, like, well, I don't know if it's such a good name. Part of it's a good name, but part of it isn't. The acronym for AJAX stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. And let's look at each word one at a time and try to form some idea of what AJAX is. A for asynchronous. Asynchronous means it doesn't have to happen at the same time. For example, voicemail would be an example of asynchronous communication, or email for that matter. So if you send me an email, all right, I don't have to be on my computer waiting for it. It will appear in my inbox, and when I am ready, when I have time to deal with it, I'll look at the email and then I'll send you a response. Okay, but we don't have to be on at the same time. I don't have to be on when you send my email. You don't have to be sitting there. I mean, you don't have to literally be there sitting and waiting, but you're waiting then for me to respond to you to do the next step. So that's what asynchronous means. All right. JavaScript, we know what that is. What we will discuss in a minute here is the role of JavaScript in AJAX. And XML. XML is a way of representing data, and it's similar to HTML, but it allows you to create your own tags. So you can create your own sort of tag structure to store any kind of data. So, for example, if you were a bookstore, you could have a book XML file that had an author tag, had a publisher tag, had a date published tag, had a category tag for whether it's fiction or nonfiction, had maybe multiple tags for reviews, and so on. You could represent that data in tags just sort of like you do in HTML. And as long as both the person that sends the data and the person that accepts the data understand that, then you're in business and you can handle it and deal with it. So it's a way of representing data. The thing about AJAX, though, is it doesn't really require the use of XML. All right, what is AJAX then? And we talked about this a little bit, but to go over again freshly, we have our basic way that web pages interact. And that is, you request a web page by typing in a URL. So type in google.com. Notice that little flick. It went out through the internet, found the Google web server, and Google responded with a web page, which consists of HTML, JavaScript, CSS, that kind of thing. So the client makes a request. The server responds to it. That's sort of the standard model that we've been working on all semester. Client is connected to the internet, and so is the web server. Client makes a request. Server sends back a response. which is going to be HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and so on. So that's a basic model. Now, we've expanded that model a little bit, and we talked about static pages that are already ready to go. And the server just takes those and delivers them to the client when the client requests them. We talked about server-side scripting, where we have scripts that the server processes and prepares an HTML, CSS, and JavaScript page. And then finally, we talked about database interaction that goes through a database server, whereas the script can inquire and pull data from the database in order to prepare a response. So like if you go to an Amazon page, and you click on a link, it will go to the database and retrieve all the information about that product in order to make the product page for you. Now, that's sort of the standard model, request, response. And so far in our studies, every response has been a complete web page. So if you click on a link, if you type in a URL, if you request something from the server, in all the examples we've gone over so far, you're getting back a complete web page from the server. AJAX is a little different than that. So the example I like to use is Google's predictive text. So for example, as soon as I click on that, I get a list of apparently the top news stories. All right. And these can be determined by a number of criteria. You know, the timeliness of them, where I'm located. If I were to do this in Finland, I might see a different set of top news stories, or top trending searches rather. So if I start to type something in, like an H, it will show me the top things that begin with H. A T, it will show me the trending things that start with HT, M, L, and so on. So it narrows it down with each key I press. Now, if you think about that, something funny is going on here. By something funny, I mean something that's different than the standard model that we're talking about. Because pulling up those trending searches sure looks like something that would probably happen in the database side. Yet the client doesn't access the database. The client only accesses everything that's been set to it as part of the page. Well, the web server is not sending a copy of the Google database in some format or another to the client when you go to Google's homepage. So therefore, something else is going on. And that something else is a little request, an HTTP request, or an XML HTTP request rather. So I'm a little hard to read maybe, but there's another kind of request. And the server responds, just like servers do, but the server doesn't respond with an entire web page. The server responds with a piece of data. All right. And that piece of data then is used to alter the page that's already been loaded. So if I was going to define AJAX succinctly, I would say that AJAX is when there are requests made to the server for data after the page loads without loading a brand new page. Because if you notice this here, if I request a new page, even though it's very brief, I see a little flicker. So that is the web page being redrawn. All right. Whereas with here, I don't see any flicker. It simply appears in that box. All right. So let's talk about the anatomy of an AJAX request. So AJAX requests go like this. First of all, there's the initial page load. That is like any other request response situation that we've discussed in this class or elsewhere. Client asks the web server for a page. Client responds with, or the server responds to the client with HTML, CSS, JavaScript. Something happens. In other words, an event happens, right? We've talked about this when we were talking about JavaScript initially, that there are certain events that happen when a page is loaded. For example, in the case of Google, type a character. In other AJAX applications, it might be that I click a button. Could be that I put my mouse over something. Could be any number of things. It could be just that the page has finished loading. Because we're going to look at an example that we've seen already this semester of AJAX, where it's not obvious as AJAX, but it actually is. All right, so that something happens. And JavaScript is going to make a request to the server. But it's not requesting a whole page. It is an XML HTTP request. So it's a different kind of request. And it's not getting back a whole page, it's getting back a piece of data. And despite what the name says, it does not have to be in XML format. It could be in some other format, and we'll see examples of that. The client then waits for a response. Just like if you sent me an email, you're going to make a request to me and in the form of an email. So you send an email to me, you're requesting for an answer or something, you send it, and then you wait for me to respond. Because I'm not necessarily sitting there at my computer answering emails in real time. I answer them again when I'm available. All right. So we now switch over to the server side. Server processes a request and returns data. All right. That's similar to just a regular HTML or HTTP request. The difference is it's data, not a whole page. So in the case of the Google request, as I type in characters, I send a request to the server, it responds with the top 10 trending searches that match that pattern of characters that I've typed in. So it's not sending back an entire HTML page, it's sending back, and again, I don't know because I'm not looked at the code, but this could be returned as XML possibly. Could be returned in some other format as well. part of this process is the client is notified. That the request is finished. And then JavaScript takes the data and displays it somehow on the page. So in this case, we load the Google homepage, we type a character. JavaScript makes a request to the server for give me the top 10 trending searches. Just give me that. And the client waits there. Google's web server processes that request and returns the top 10 trending searches that match what has been typed in. It's data, not a whole page. The client gets notified that the request is finished. JavaScript is going to take that data and display it on the page. So think for a second, if you will, where we might have seen this already in the semester. So just think in your own mind, have we seen something like this in the semester? And I already tipped it off that yes, we have. And we actually saw it with the weather application that we did. And that might not be obvious that that's an AJAX request, but it is. All right, and we'll take a look at that AJAX request and we will define why it is an AJAX request. So this is going to do an AJAX request one way. AJAX requests can be done any number of different ways, and we'll look at several of them, and each have their advantages and disadvantages. For the purposes of this class, I don't care how you do it, as long as you truly make an AJAX request to a page. So I click on this HTML document. Right off the bat, it asks me, do I want to give permission to divulge my location? I'm going to say yes. And there we get the weather here. Rainy, 5 degrees centigrade, 41 Fahrenheit. Getting chilly out there. Light rain. And it knows that we're in Sheffield, USA. Now that looks, it's not apparent that that's an AJAX request because unlike Google, I'm not typing something in. Now the version of it that you did with City is maybe more obvious that that's an AJAX request. All right, but this is as well. Let's follow through our recipe and see what happens. The initial page loads. So that web page loads. Something happens. In this case, the something that happened is that the page is finished loading. In other words, there isn't a user action like the user presses a button or the user types a key. In this case, the event that occurs is simply that the page is finished loading. It asks us if we want to divulge our location. We answer. Then JavaScript makes a request to the web server, the weather web server. It says, give me the data for whatever my location is. I believe it passes the latitude and longitude. And is asking for a piece of data. And then the client waits. The server processes the request and returns the data. It's data, not a whole page. Now, if you remember, the data that comes back from the weather server is JSON data, JavaScript object notation, which is comparable to XML in that it allows us to display allows us to represent a piece of data. If you think about weather, there's any number of attributes about weather, you know, whether there is precipitation or not, what the temperature is, what the wind is, what the wind direction is, when is sunrise and sunset for that day, all kinds of information that potentially could be returned back when you're dealing with the weather. And the client is notified that the request is finished. JavaScript then takes the data that was sent back and displays it somehow on the page. Well, how does it display it on the page? By filling in the temperature, precipitation, and the location. And it fills in this little icon that indicates that it's drizzly. So let's look at the code for this. And we're going to focus on the AJAX part of it. And we're going to see where each of those little things happen. All right, it's actually in app.js. So let me open that. All right, these are all functions that occur initially when the page loads. Here is asking us if we are, if we support geolocation. To refresh my memory about this. Here's where it asks permission, it gets the location. Otherwise, it will tell me that it's not, that we're on an old browser and it's not. We call this here, we show error if it's where error. If this works, we call set position. Now, this is where I don't really like this code. And I talked about this before, and I don't want to go on too long of a diversion here, but they put their JavaScript at the very end of the page. So they know that the page is loaded before they start executing these statements. And that's okay, but I don't think that's very stylish. All right. It would be better in my mind to have and to assign an onload event to the page and have this code on the onload event. The end result's the same. When the page loads, this code gets executed. But I think it's better to really make that explicit that this works on load. Because if I move the position of this JS file from down here to somewhere else on the page, page breaks. Whereas if you did it my method, I could put that JS file wherever I wanted to. And because it creates an onload event, it's going to work. All right, set position, grabs the latitude and longitude, calls get weather. All right, here's where the action starts. We have get weather with the latitude and longitude. This is the request that we're going to send to the web server. We're going to send a request to this URL. And we're going to plug in our latitude and longitude. So this line right here, the fetch is making the request. So let's look at our checklist over here. The initial page loaded. Something happened. In our case, the something happened is the page had finished loading. That's why I suggest that this might not be as obvious as AJAX, because it kind of happens all at once when the page starts. It may be more obvious if you look back to your example with the entry of a city. So the page is finished loading. JavaScript makes a request to the server. It's an HTTP request, and it's asking for a piece of data. That's the request it's making. Here it's making it. All right. Then it waits. You can find more details about the way a fetch works here. It describes it. Fetch method starts the process of fetching data from a resource. Oh. I guess this doesn't go into much detail. All right. Now the server does its thing. We don't have access to the server code. All right. But we can trust that when we call this URL and make the request to this URL, that this server does its thing. And it's going to return back some data. That data is going to be in this variable response. So the variable response is the data that gets returned from the server. So that's the piece of data. And the client waits for it. This then function is the function that gets called when the client is notified that the server is done. So this is different than other programming statements. In other programming statements, things operate sequentially. This happens, this happens, this happens, and so on down the line. In this case, this statement is called, and it goes to make the request of the to the server. This doesn't execute immediately. It only gets executed when the server responds and the client is notified of that response. So that response is the piece of data that comes back from the server. And we take that data and we turn it into a JSON object. We're going to get that data back as just a long string of data. We need to take it as JSON data, but it's coming back as a string that contains JSON data. We have to actually make a JavaScript object for that, and that's what this does. This says take that string that you got back from the server and convert it to JSON data and return it. Then this kicks in, where we fill in our spots on our JSON object that we created, and we pull the different pieces of data from the JSON response that we've gotten back. And then finally, we display the weather. So the then is the code that executes when the client is notified that the request is finished. And the rest of that, and then whatever this says, then the rest of this from here down is a client doing something and ending up displaying the data. Okay, I have another example for you that we can look at here. In this example, we're going to see maybe a more complete picture because I've written both the client and the server side. In this case, we're only looking, in the first example we went over, we're only looking at the client side aspect of it. And to be honest, the client side has the bigger role in AJAX. Maybe that's why they put JavaScript in the name AJAX. Because the JavaScript does the bulk of the work. JavaScript makes the request. JavaScript takes the data and displays it on the page. All the server does is what the servers normally do. That is, process a request and send back data. In fact, the server does actually less with AJAX because it's not sending back an entire HTML page. It's just sending back a chunk of data. And that data could just be a simple string of data. It could be XML data, could be JSON data, whatever. So let's look at this example. First AJAX. And here we revisit our good old friend, the heart calculator. So I'm going to take all this data, and I'm going to copy it into a special directory. C, inetpub, www-root. Paste that in there. And we go and run it. And I hate that it does that now. Here we are. Now, we have our calculator. And let's see what version of the calculator we have. We have our version that takes us to another page. All right. We also showed you last time, or the time before, I think the time before, how to do a post back where we stay on the same page. Guess what though? We don't really stay on the same page. We call the same page back a second time. So 2 pages are loaded even with the post back. The initial form and the result that we display along with the initial form. That's actually still 2 requests made to the server. Here we have calculator for AJAX. When I type that in, we get that response instantly, and it doesn't require reloading the page. Similar to the jQuery version, does the same thing. So let's look at this. So let's look at calculator AJAX. Okay. All right. We have our JavaScript script. We create an HTTP request object. Actually, this would be an XML HTTP object. What is this object? This object is the pipeline that the client and server are going to use to communicate with each other. It's going to contain the request. It's going to contain the notifications that the server is done, or actually what part of the process the server is on, because there's actually several different statuses of a request. And then finally, it's going to return back the data that represents the response. So we create this request object. Now this is outside of any function. Because it's outside of any function, it can be used within any function. Which makes sense because a lot of people are going to need to use this object. This is the way that the client and server communicate with each other. So this is going to be needed used in a lot of places. When we click the button, we call process form. Process form validates the form, doing whatever validation we need to do. And if the page is valid, if the form is valid, it makes the AJAX call. Now let's look at the make the AJAX call. This makes a request to the server. Let's look at what that request is going to consist of. And this is similar to the fetch, right? We have our URL that we're going to call. Now, in the case of the weather app, that URL was on a different web server than our own. So we had http:// API weather, blah, 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 blah. Here we have just the name of the server-side script that we're going to call. And it's named checkrangeajax.php. We're going to pass on the query string 2 pieces of information: the age and the number of beats per 10 seconds. We concatenate that to get the URL of the request. The URL of the request that we want it to look something like this. Age equals whatever the age equals, ampersand beats equal however many their heartbeats are. So this instruction forms that. We have, here's a check range PHP question mark. Oh, txt age and txt beats. We concatenate that and get our answer. Here's where we're making the request. All right. We're saying we're using the get method. So that means that we're passing the data as part of the query string. You can also post data to the request if you want to. A little bit different syntax with that. This is our callback number, more or less. If you leave a voicemail message asynchronously, you might say, hey, this is Mike. Give me a call at 440-555-5555 or something like that. This is a callback function. In other words, when the status of this request changes, this guy gets called. Then we actually make the request. This is the equivalent of Captain Picard saying, make it so. We formed the request. We specified everything about that request. Here we're making a request. Now the server does its thing. And it might be surprising to see how simple the server's code is in this case. check range AJAX. We have our include file, does some validation, calls the proper function. Notice this again uses the same function. So it doesn't matter if we're using the chart, if we're using the regular calculator, if we're using the AJAX calculator, all of these use the exact same function in this hard include. So no matter what, we're not going to get inconsistent results. Now, if our calculation in that include file was wrong, we might get incorrect results, but we're not going to get inconsistent results. And all we'd have to do is fix it. So all this does is it prints if there's an error. And it prints one of these three lines. You're below. So it's either going to print that there's an error, or it's going to print that you are below optimal, you are in optimal range, or you're above optimal range. Notice there's no formatting. We're not outputting a TH tag or a H1 tag or anything like that. It's JavaScript's job to figure out how to display the data. We're only returning the data. And in this case, the data is a string that either contains errors that were made, or it contains an indication of whether they're in the range or not. That's all this does. So when this status gets changed, this function gets called. Let's look at the list of possible ready states, because there's more than one ready state. The ready state is the status of the request. Status of 0 means that we have just started the request. Status of 1 means that we've actually made the request, or we've opened the request. Here we actually send it. Here is downloading the results, which could be a long process if we were requesting a big chunk of data. And then finally, a status of 4 indicates that the server's done its job and is finished. So this gets called every time that status changes, every time that ready state changes. We're only interested in, though, when the status is 4, because that indicates that it's done. And what do we do with it? We take the response text that came back from the request on the pipeline and put it in the inner HTML of the thing called results. So we pop that right in there. Now, I always like to show you like things that could go wrong and how you can figure things out. One thing that you could do, because this could go wrong in 3 places, right? You could make the request wrong, the server could process it wrong, and we could not be displaying it correctly. So how can I tell that I made the request correctly? Well, I know, or I should know, what the URL the server's expecting. Again, in this case, we wrote the server code, so we should know that. In the other case, we have the API to tell us what the URL needs to look for the weather application. So what I can do is I can actually display the URL in the console. And look at it and make sure it's correct. So let's say I misspelled this. Make an easy mistake. we get some kind of error, right? We can actually look at console. And notice that, well, that's not the right URL. If we know what the URL is supposed to be, which we should know, then by doing a console log, we can verify that the URL is correct. How do we test this middle section of the server doing its job? Well, we know what the URL should be. We can actually type that URL into the address line and see what results it gives us. And that's the result we get, which is the result that we should expect to get. So two people could work on this. One person could work on the server side and they can test their code this way by putting in numbers and seeing if it gets the expected results. Finally, then, we can write to the console this response text to see if we're getting back the right response. From the server. Because if we're getting the right response from the server, then we know there's some problem with this code here that's writing it incorrectly to the page. Because sometimes it's much more complicated than this. In fact, your weather example is more complicated than this. It didn't have just simply one thing to display on the page. We look at the log, we see the response text that we get back. And we displayed it right, so there's no problem. But if we were doing something more involved, we would know then, hey, we got back from the answer from the server. Something is in our code that's displaying it incorrectly. Avoid the temptation to put HTML in your response. The response should just be data. It should have nothing to do with the way it's being displayed, because there's a potential I could be using the same server script in a bunch of places. And I might not always want to display the answer the same way. So the JavaScript, the client-side code, should be responsible for formatting that data. And if I want to put an H1 around the data to make it big, or that would be bad because it's not really a heading. If I wanted to put a strong tag around this, put a strong tag around it in the HTML. Don't put a strong tag around it in the server code. Oh, uncaught exception. Process form is not defined. Ooh. Went and screwed something up. Oh, I used a PHP concatenate. PHP, you can use a dot to concatenate. So it didn't load my stuff. Again, I'm having the same problem. What? Oh. And there we output it with a strong tag around it. Okay, before, I know it's Thanksgiving weekend, we will talk about next time our jQuery version of this. That does things pretty much the same way, but uses jQuery. You could do any of your AJAX requests using the fetch, using the jQuery, using just plain old JavaScript. They all kind of have their value, and you can use the one that makes sense for you. All right, we'll cover this in more detail next week. All right, if there are no questions, I will see you either next week or in lab. Questions? All right.